Well, hello again, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and this is another in the occasional series of anniversary shows I'm going to be hosting as we go through 2022 and the same next year. So trying to pick up events on the anniversary of when they happened. In this case, we're actually going back 81 years. The event we're talking about happened 81 years ago, but generally I'm going to be picking up the 80th anniversary. So we're interrupting our sojourn through the Pacific to go off to Italy today and talk about the first raid by British parachute forces in World War II. And my guest has been on World War II TV before. The links to his previous appearance, Western Arnhem, are in the description below, as are a link to the book that he wrote that covers this assault that we're talking about. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Niall Cherry again. So good evening, Neil. How are you doing?
Good evening, Paul, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to Anchor in Wharton.
Good. So, first airborne operation, and this is something that you've particularly studied, that kind of early period formation of airborne forces, because by the end of the war, it's all fairly neat, isn't it? We have the parachute regiment, we have the SAS, these other kind of organizations, but in that 41, there's some sort of units that don't last very long, and commandos and paratroopers kind of split and merge and go off. And so before we get into the presentation, kind of how difficult is it studying that early period when people haven't quite got the identity they had later?
I'll answer your question with one of my famous side answers that doesn't really answer your question. The first nominal role for the number 2 Airborne Commando, as they were known as brackets, was done in a school exercise book.
Right. Okay.
And another problem you've got is most of the guys who went through their parachute course at Ringway don't exist. There are no records basically for the guys who did their 6 jumps at Ringway or 6 or 8 jumps at Ringway in the early months. It was all really done on the back of a fag packet. The current expression, back of a fag packet, I think really fits in well with the formation of the special service as it was known in those days. And realistically, Churchill wanted to get some good publicity, if those are the right words, some propaganda after the debacle of Dunkirk. Obviously I do cover it, sorry to plug the book, but you talk about Major Todd took the first commando raid about 3 or 4 days after Churchill had issued his command or his orders about these commando raids. And the independent companies who'd been in Norway in 1940, a lot of the volunteers who'd volunteered for these independent companies hadn't been posted back to their parent units because they were going to be disbanded, and they formed the nucleus of the commandos, and basically they had no selection whatsoever. And then you fast forward 2 years. Another example that I always remember that sticks in my mind, they did a commando raid on Guernsey, which I think was called Ambassador in 1940, and it was an absolute shambles. And 2 of the blokes couldn't even swim because there was no boat on the shore, and the officer said to them, well, come on in, lads, you need to swim out to this boat, this Royal Navy ship, get back to England. They said, we can't swim, sir. Right. So I suppose it's almost like saying, as long as you could breathe and had got two legs, 2 arms and 2 eyes or something, you're almost in the special service in those days. And then you fast forward a few years, guys had to have, for example, good teeth, good eyesight, be able to run, but there was realistically very little selection in those days.
This is why when we get to this measuring the success of airborne operations or special forces operations, we was talking to Sol David about this last year. You can't necessarily measure it by the results of the actual operation early in the war. You measure it by the kind of the change of doctrine, the introduction of forces that will be game changers later on. Because as we know with some of these early raids, the actual success of it is a little bit kind of debatable, and we'll go into that this evening, I guess.
Yes, we will. We'll try and touch on that, but I agree with you. I mean, to be honest with you, you could virtually, apart in 1940 and most of an early 41, you could write off all of the operations as being failures. To be honest with you, if we fast forward to another anniversary coming up later this month, as you well know, Bruneval was realistically February 42 was the first real successful combined operation. achieved its objective and brought back some prisoners. And we throw in some of the late ones, which we've done before. Claymore up in
Norway,
late 1941. Again, another success. So I think it's like everything you go through. I suppose I hate to talk about COVID and that, but we've gone through some horrendous learning curve through COVID, and that's almost like the Commando and Airborne operations of 1940-41.
Yeah. It's making a statement, isn't it? It's making a statement that, as you said, the Dunkirk had been a debacle. We've got to show something. We've got to show ourselves, the world, the enemy, that we're not out of the fight. And even if these operations don't quite work, they're sending that message out that, we're trying, we're out to do things, we're going to adopt these new techniques. And wherever you are in Europe, wherever you are, you German Nazis, we can get to you. We can get to you by canoe or kayak or parachute or glider. So be on your guard. And that's, I suppose, the message they're sending. But anyway, and yes, folks, we have got Bruneval shows coming up, one of which will be with Neil and one with Damien Lewis. We're going to a Bruneval Operation Biting double bill for you later in the month. So anyway, without further ado, Neil's come prepared with a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm going to hand it over to you, and I will be jumping in with my questions. And if folks, you have questions, fire away. But over to Mr. Cherry.
Thank you very much. So we can quickly go through this. As basically, it's just said that it was known as Operation Colossus because I guess they hoped it would have far wide-ranging results, for want of a better word. And I suppose in theory they did, which we'll hopefully touch on in a little bit shortly. So if we go to the next one, Paul. So I'll just say, I called this the road to Tragino. And obviously air power came to the fore in the Great War. Obviously supplies were dropped from the front line on the Western Front, and the Russians, to give them their credit, were the first guys to really recognize the advantages of airborne warfare, as I said. And they invited, I find this somewhat strange really, that armies used to invite observers to see their exercises, in 35, 36. So the British and the British military attaché and the German, we sent the general, that's right. We sent the general, the German military attaché, and they sent them to the 35 and 36 Russian army moves. And the British representative said on the first 135, such novelties would not have a great influence on the future course of war. So he was still, I suppose, if you like, thinking back to the Great War, static warfare, 2 lines of trenches from the North Sea down to Switzerland again. But you look at that little comment there from the German military attaché. On his return to Moscow, sent an immediate top secret signal to Berlin saying he'd seen a revolutionary transformation in the technique of war. So this, if you like, fitted in nicely with the German idea of blitzkrieg, which was coming to the fore. So I've just included this picture to give people an idea of perhaps what it was like. Now, this huge plane known as a Tupolev ANT-6 was a large, as you can see, 4-engine fixed undercarriage aircraft. There was a hatch. If you can see the guys, if you can use your pointer, Paul. All right.
Can't use the pointer. The pointer doesn't work anymore with this system. It's changed.
All right, fair enough. So
you have to describe where you're pointing.
Yeah, if on the top of the fuselage between the tailplane and the pilot's cockpit, there was a hatch. The guys used to have to climb out of there, get themselves on the wing, and then I guess in smaller groups they would then slide down the wing and pull their own ripcord. I was thinking about this the other day. Obviously, the photo's been taken from this side, but hopefully there were some guys over the other side. Otherwise, the plane might be flying a bit like that with all the blokes on one wing. But that was the Russian way of doing it. At these manoeuvres, they dropped airborne forces, and they said they successfully captured an enemy HQ. So quickly moving on. So, of course, the Germans, if you like, as we said, started forming their parachute and airborne troops. They were Luftwaffe, and they played an integral part in the Blitzkrieg in 1940, used in Norway to capture an airfield. And then, of course, in May 1940, I'm sure you all heard about the fort at Abenamel, and also in Holland, capturing bridges for their lightning advance across the Netherlands. And Hitler, as you can see, this was the first real successful use of, well, I'm going to say the first successful use of airborne troops in the war.
Yeah.
And I think it really, I mean, I cover this in my somewhere in a few lines, and we've all seen Dad's Army. German paratroopers dropping as nuns, butchers' boys, all the rest of it, all the fifth column, German saboteurs, airborne panic, for want of a better word. So realistically, when you look at Urban Amel, a small number of German paratroopers in their gliders knocked out that so-called vital fortress on the Albert Canal there, I think it is, and had an impact far greater than their size.
Yeah.
But anyway, let's crack on a bit. So the British response to all of this, obviously, when Churchill came to be Prime Minister in May 1940, and after the debacle of Dunkirk, he wrote a memo in June 42 saying we ought to have a corps of at least 5,000 paratroop troops, including Australians, New Zealanders, Canadians, with trustworthy people from Norway and France, etc., etc., etc. Pray let me have a note from the War Office on the subject. So basically, as a result of that, they ordered a Royal Engineer officer called Major Rock to set up what was known as the Central Landing Establishment, RAF Ringway. The RAF Wingway is now, of course, Manchester International Airport, and I suspect it was chosen because it wasn't likely to have much interference from the Germans for training purposes, and, if you like, out of the way from where the Battle of Britain was going to be going on. So the RAF were, and I'll be completely open and honest with you. I'm going to kill my daughter here. She's managed to spell Whitley bombers as Whiteleys, so you don't need to worry about looking for a new RAF aircraft.
In the tried and tested way of commanders, you're blaming someone else, Neil.
Absolutely. I didn't get where I am today by not blaming somewhere else. So the Whitley bombers designed this airborne clothing, often in the early days based on German equipment we'd captured in Europe before Dunkirk. And of course, they'd formed, if you like. I don't want to go too much. And actually, Paul, there is a subject of yet another perhaps interesting talk, the formation of the Commandos in 1940, or the Special Service. Yeah. But basically, each district in the country had been told to form at least one commando. And number 2 commando just happened to be based at Knutsford, in Cheshire, which is very close to Manchester Airport. So some staff guy at the War Office said, right, number 2 commando, you are now becoming an airborne unit and you're off the Ringway to learn how to parachute. And they became known as number 2 open bracket airborne close bracket commando in their early days. So if you like, this is some of the rudimentary parachute training. Sorry, I need to just my notes just to add a little bit here. The RAF grudgingly gave 6 of these obsolete Whitley bombers and 1,000 parachutes for this. So obviously we weren't going to be able to train large numbers of men with only 1,000 parachutes and 6 men. Another person's name I just want to mention here, 3rd of July 1940, Lieutenant Colonel Jackson from the Royal Tank Regiment. Can we go back one, Paul? Just back one for the moment. So, from the Royal Tank Regiment was arrived to take command of number 2. Yeah. So this, if you like, was some of the rudimentary training. Circus trapezes comes to mind, but however, these swings, for want of a better word, would not be unfamiliar to any modern day guy going through his basic parachute course at RAF Bryce Norton today. The thing I do like to say about this is these commandos must have been the RSM's nightmare, to be honest with you, because you look at the guys, we've got presumably a guardsman in the middle because he's slightly taller with his cheese cutter hat on, and then you've got the 4.5, the fish and chip shop bag hats as well, and other guys wearing berets, tam o' shanters, all sorts of weird and wonderful uniforms. It must have been a nightmare for the RSM. Anyway, I digress. So anyway, let's move on there, Paul, to the next one. And then somebody as well, just to try and speed up the training a bit, to save petrol or the aircraft, decided that we'd use barrage balloons to jump from. And this again is another thing. It was enabled large numbers of men to get their first jump in pretty quickly and economically. Just winch the aircraft up, bring it down, go off and get a new parachute, send them up again to do it. And this, the first 2 jumps, even on the basic parachute course, up till the 1980s, used to be carried out from this sort of apparatus. Not quite the same cage, but not dissimilar to that. And of course, the other thing, of course, is that in theory was going to mimic the exit from the Whitley bomber, where they cut a hole in the floor. If we had more time on this talk, we could also go through the development of the airborne forces at Ringway, because in the early days, the guys used to...
keep on talking. There's someone at my door. Keep on talking.
Yes. Okay, they would climb down to the back of the Whitley bomber where the rear turret had been removed, and the guy would hang onto a bar facing forwards, and then the RAF PJI would pull his ripcord and he would get done in what was known as the pull-off method. But of course, this was a very slow method of doing it. So ideally, that was when they came up with the idea of cutting the hole in the floor in the Whitley, and hopefully the guys would be able to get out a little bit quicker.
I'm back. I just had a
Excellent.
parcel delivered at 8 o'clock at
very
night.
good, very good. Not one of my books, I hope.
No, yours are too
Excellent
expensive
choice.
at the moment.
Yes. So if you wouldn't mind, we've just about killed that slide to death.
Yep, now we move on now. Yep.
Yes, we can. So the guy in the middle of the photograph, that's Colonel Jackson, the first commanding officer of No. 2 Commando. You can just see his Royal Tank Regiment badge on his right arm. Top brass decided they wanted a visit there. And this is one of the photographs taken on one of the visits in December 1940. It's actually Sir John Dill, showing him some of the special paratrooper clothing. You can see the Bren gun, and you will note that the protective headgear, the leather jumping jacket, which was the first jumping headgear that they wore in the early days. And of course that then developed. There wasn't the thing as the parachutist helmet, and there wasn't what was known as the rubber bungie, the helmet that, if you like, the best way of describing that is the one that Violet Szabo or Virginia McKenna wore when her parachute training in Arnhem with pride. Let's move on quickly then, Paul, to the next one. So this is the guy, you may recall we mentioned Major Rock, John Rock. That's him in the great coat with the gas mask sling going right to left. Just again, and the guy in the another man who was the founding father of the Airborne Forces in the Glengarry to the left of the general in the middle, that's Captain Martin Lindsay. And basically, when men were dying in the parachute accidents, Lindsay and Rock were the first two men out of the next parachute descent. So they tried to lead from the front. As I said, just digressing slightly, John Rock died in a flying accident in 1942. Anyway, so he never made it to the end of the war.
It is just brief acknowledging, Neil, that every country that is starting a parachute forces is having to learn how to do everything. I mean, as you said, they haven't got the gear. The Americans are famously using football helmets. They're improvising knee pads. They're developing how to land on the ground. All this stuff is new. I mean, yes, there had been parachutes in the military for people bailing out of aircraft for a number of years, but the actual idea of landing combat soldiers is all still in its infancy. There are people probably watching who went through parachute school in America, Britain, Canada, in the last 20 years or so, and by then it's an art. Everyone knows exactly what they're doing, how it works, and they've got all this data to work on. In this era here, it was just have a go and see what works.
We'll try and develop something, see if it works. If it doesn't, we'll try something else, and we'll come on to that, I think, in the next slide. This is a good one. As I say, I like all the different types of protective headgear that the guys have got to jump in. And also, this is, if you like, was something that was based on a German model, was the side lacing crepe-soled boot that you can see in the insole. But they didn't last long. Obviously, they worked out that the normal boot was sufficient. So these side lacing boots got basically canned.
And the reason for the side laces is to not interfere with the rigging lines, isn't it? Supposedly.
Yes. Yeah. But as I say, it was almost like we were doing in a few months what the Germans had done in 5 years, 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
But you're quite right. It was almost like, as I said, a lot of that was also because we'd had captured Fallschirmjäger clothing or got it from prisoners and various other sources on Europe. A lot of our initial stuff like this, the guy on the right-hand side of the photograph standing up, that is a German, modelled on the German Fallschirmjäger Steckwin smock, as it was known.
Yeah.
And they wore something like that most of the war as an oversmock to like have a smooth outline, so rigging lines would not get caught on webbing or bunt your containers or whatever, weapons or so on and so on. So interesting photos, and sadly we don't know any of the names in them, but lost in the sands of time. But it's a world apart from what you see in 3 or 4 years time at Ringway.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so now we're starting to get into the good stuff. Well, I wouldn't say the good stuff. It's all good stuff, isn't it? So,
it's all brilliant, Neil. I'm in a good mood. Everyone's in a good mood. Yeah,
colossal entertainment tonight. Yes. So in theory, this is another one of those things where the civilians aid the military. As I said, this guy came up from George Kent and Sons, one of their managers or directors, suggested to the War Office that if this aqueduct in Italy could be destroyed, it would severely damage the Italian war effort. Italy was fighting at the time in Albania, as it says, fighting the Greeks. And obviously Italy was our enemy, and it was the only place apart from North Africa where we were fighting the Italians. And the Italian forces were being supported logistically through Taranto, Brindisi and Bari on that side of the coast, if you like. I'm just trying to think, what's that? The eastern side of Italy.
Side, yeah.
And the RAF declined to take the operation because they said we'll never be able to hit that small target in there. And so realistically, the only option was Britain's parachute unit. The Commandos couldn't do it because they would have had to have got 60 miles inland or something like that. I always call them, and because most other people do, we'll call them the 11th Special Air Service Battalion, they'd had their name changed to the 11th Special Air Service Battalion. It wasn't actually the 11th Special Air Service Battalion. It was written as 1-1, the Roman numeral 2. So, but everybody, and me included, calls them the 11th Special Air Service Battalion.
It's that thing we said about the naming and changing in this era. They're named one unit one week, and the next week it gets changed by someone.
Yes.
It's that the small scale raiding force, special post. It's the era of name changes every week.
Yes. So we came up. So basically, they thought, we're fighting Italy in North Africa. If we can do something to their ports, we might be able to affect the fighting in North Africa, which it wasn't. Was it going pretty well for us in 1941 in there, because with O'Connor, but it was all swings and roundabouts, and the Germans were going to be coming in very soon and make 1941 a difficult year in North Africa. Yeah. But anyway, the idea was, let's go and have a go at this aqueduct in Italy near Naples. When I say near Naples, 70 miles from Naples. So let's go. So next slide, please. So there you are, people. If you've never seen this photograph before, you are now looking at the 1941 intelligence brief for the raid. That basically was all they had. This was a postcard taken, or a picture taken, when the aqueduct was being built in 1928, and the huts, if you like, were for the workmen and what have you, and they were no longer there. But it gives you an idea also. I think there's a good slide, isn't it? If you can, I know people, these days we always say photographic reconnaissance, blah, 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 reams and reams of paper on the opposition, and this is all they had to go on. This one postcard, basically. And
again, it's the years, isn't it? A couple of years later, we did. This time, it's still the baby steps. That at this point we've barely got an army, we've barely got any tanks. We haven't got the ability to get aerial reconnaissance of every square inch of Italy. A few years later, we'd have photos, as you say, coming out of our ears.
But I think the other thing to notice is look at the terrain of where this aqueduct is in the background. We've got some colour photographs taken in recent years in there, people. But I don't want to spoil the surprise when we get there. So then the next one is, because obviously this George Kent, who had been involved with the design and the actual manufacture, they still had some technical drawings. So this is, if you like, this is the second part of the intelligence brief for the guys who were going. And this would, if you like, was supposedly going to help the engineers, because obviously we're going to blow it up. So we'll come on to that in a little bit. But you need to take some engineers with you too, because they like apparently blowing things up. Yeah. So this, if you like, was the idea of, this is how this is what the viaduct was constructed like. Off you go and do your planning. just to give you from Google Earth, apologies if you, as I say, Paul, I'm gonna embarrass Mr. Woodadge now, and he spent a good 5 minutes trying to find the area on Google Earth.
You're joking. It was longer than 5 minutes. I just put in, oh my God, I had to find it, folks, by kind of going to Google Maps and back.
Is to put in Calitri. If you want to have a look at it yourself, you put in Calitri, Calitri, and then just try and look for this area. You know, it's anyway, it's basically the aqueduct. I can spot it easily. It's, if you like where the arrow is, you go into the woodland and there is a tiny little black rectangle there, swimming pool state, and that is the aqueduct. That's it today. There's a bit more. So we've done a bit of a close up to help you out. There's a major road. When I say a major road, it's a 2-laned. You'll see in a minute, people, that what the roads, the tracks are like around here. But there is a major road about a mile further north, and there's a tiny little turning, and you eventually wind your way down here. So there's the aqueduct down in the sort of bottom right-hand corner, and I've put another arrow there. Just to show you what the village is, the people living like there today, where the second arrow is in the middle. So you can see this is really rural Italian. I hate to use the word peasant farmers, but you know, they don't look great, do they?
Well, I'm from Essex, Neil, so for me that looks quite exotic. Yeah, but anyway.
And the other thing I'm going to say is they don't get many battlefield tourists going down here either.
No.
So beware of the dogs if you ever fancy going down there.
Right.
I think that's
introduction to the location. So now that's the plan. Yeah,
it's the plan. So I've kept it a very simple plan. 7 stages: fly to Malta, leave Malta for Italy, parachute into the Tragino Aqueduct, blow it up, walk overland to the River Selly estuary, get picked up by a Royal Navy submarine, and return to England. Simple. So that was the plan on paper, and it became known as Operation Colossus. Going to spend a couple of minutes just talking about this, if you like. So obviously Colonel Jackson was taken in the know and said, you need to find some men to carry out this raid in Italy. And he decided that he would use his second in command, a guy named Trevor Pritchard, but otherwise known as Tag, because his initials were TAG, to take part in command. And Tag Pritchard chose 5 officers to take part, including 2 Royal Engineers. These 6 officers all chose up to 5 men to be in their section. 1 officer and 2 men were selected as reserves, and in total there were 39 men from the unit. Please stay on this slide for a moment, Paul. Don't get an itchy finger, please, if you wouldn't mind. Making 39 men in total. So obviously, as the aim of blowing something up was there, we needed Royal Engineers sappers. So there were 2 Royal Engineers sappers officers, and they all chose 5 men each. So we have 10 Royal Engineers going on the raid. It's basically, it's said that Jackson got the men on parade in Knutsford and said, men, I've got something to tell you. There's something big coming up. I can't tell you what it is at the moment, but the chances of you coming back are pretty much slim. You might be, if you get captured, you might be shot as a secret agent or a spy, although you will be dropped in normal army uniforms. And he ended that by asking for volunteers for this raid. And I've been lucky enough to speak to 3 men who were on that parade and also on the raid, and every one of them said that every single man on the parade of 500 stepped forward. So that left the officers with the difficult task of deciding who they were going to take. So if you wouldn't mind, we'll go to the next slide just to say a few things. So I did blow them up a bit, so they look a bit elongated, but you've got Major Pritchard in the middle, who was the commander, and these were 2 of the guys who were going to command the infantry sections, for want of a better word, to act as, if you like, the guard force while the sappers did their work. Captain Christopher Lee from the Royal Fusiliers. Tag Pritchard was from the Royal Welch Fusiliers. Lieutenant Dean Drummond, his name may be well known to quite a lot of you, just for the fact is that he had a small role in a Bridge Too Far film. He was at Arnhem. Another Arnhem connection, just to go round the circle. Captain Lee had a brother called George Lee, and he was the commander of the 11th Parachute Battalion at Arnhem. Anyway, so those are three of the officers. Now we've got two more of the officers on the next slide, please. Second Lieutenant Jowett, he was from the Highland Light Infantry, and Second Lieutenant Patterson, he was the assistant demolition officer, because there was a guy called Captain Daly. He was going to be the demolitions officer, but for various reasons that will become clear later, I don't mention him too much in this talk, although he did make it to Tragino. So again, as I said, these guys were meant to select some good men, or men they felt suitable, they could trust to be in their little either infantry section or engineer section. So if we could go to the next slide. And I'm sure many of you that know the Tragino Aqueduct raid or Operation Colossus, this is one of the few photographs of men of ex-troop taken in January 41. Sorry. I do apologise for the poor quality of it, but we are very lucky to have any photographs, if you think about it, of them at all. So this is, if you like, was taken probably at Tatton Park, which was the drop zone taken for it. So if we could quickly move on. Oh, sorry, just before we go, that is very much the clothing that they wore when they went on the raid as well. Anyway, let's crack on. So now we come to, for once, the army decided to do something correctly, shall we say, and because they were going to Italy, it was decided that some Italian speakers might be useful to take on the raid. So there was actually a guy in the 11th or the 2nd. The guy on the left, Private Nicole Nastri, went on the raid, but under the name of John Tristan. So you can see there's a picture of him taken later on in the war. He was obviously given papers and dog tags calling him John Tristan to try and protect his identity in case of capture and any possible charges of treason, because he was actually been born in Italy. But he'd lived in London most of his life. He'd come to London with his parents as a young boy. So secondly, in the middle, we have a very interesting character. This guy, Fortunato Picci, went on the raid as a free Frenchman, and I will hopefully you will be impressed with my non-French accent of Pierre Dupont. He was given an alias and given a number in the British Army, given a crash course of parachuting, and he only arrived with the battalion, the ex-troop, by about the 10th of 2 weeks before the operation. Only at the end of January did he actually arrive. So he was a 42-year-old man, been a waiter at the Savoy, and had volunteered for service with the British Army in 1940 when we declared war on Italians. So again, as I say, he became known as John Pierre Dupont. And then finally, Flight Lieutenant Ralph Lucky from the RAF, 44 years old. Another one given a crash course in parachuting. I do apologise for the photograph of him, because I always call him I call this man the Operation Colossus Enigma. Never been able to find a photograph of him. Whether by accident or design, in the group photograph there, he was actually adjusting his balaclava. So as you can see, he's like that, doing some of his balaclava. So his face is basically obscured in that photo. He'd been born Raoul Lukovic and served in the British Army in the Great War in the Worcestershire Regiment, winning a military cross. Changed his name to Ralph Lucky and was a fluent Italian speaker, as well as French and I think Greek as well. He wasn't commissioned until May 1940. He appears in the RAF list in 1940 as a pilot officer in the Admin and Special Duties Branch, open brackets, intelligence, close brackets. So a lot of people wondered if he was a spy, because he was an unknown entity, if you know what I mean. Why he was actually volunteered for the raid, apart from the fact he could speak Italian, we don't really know, apart from it may have been to get the RAF in on the raid. But as I say, I was having a discussion with my good friend John yesterday about him, because we were talking about it, and we wonder why he was chosen. That's the only thing we can think of, because he wasn't an SOE man, and I'll mention that briefly in a moment. He was an Italian speaker, but there would have been plenty of army officers, who could speak Italian, I would think, as well. And he was 44 years old, so he wasn't exactly super fit, shall we say. Anyway, a lot of the guys were a bit worried about Lucky. They actually thought he was a spy working for what we would now call SOE, or I doubt many of them knew what SOE was at the time. And in the 1990s, it was discovered because the SOE officer, the SOE advisor at the Foreign Office, was asked to confirm or deny in those good lays, because they won't give any information away, whether Ralph Lucky was a member of SOE in the Second World War, and they replied no. But it turned out that Peachy was indeed an SOE agent, and he was the obviously volunteer. His SOE report, if you don't mind me referring to my notes, non-politically minded but anti-fascist, an idealist, an excellent worker and organizer who cannot allow failure, wants above all things that everyone be treated fairly, is prepared to shine in all England's trials, and has no desire to be treated in any way differently from an English soldier. It does appear that the idea was that he was going to stay behind in Italy to be like the first SOE agent in Italy, which begs the question. I'll save that comment as long as I remember. Anyway, so you've got a guy who was known to them, Nico Nastri or John Tristan from the unit who'd volunteered, and two relative strangers by Peachy and Lucky. So let's move on, if we may. So the guys, when they were selected to form, they were known as ex-troop, kept apart from the rest of the battalion, took a special program. They moved out into a segregated block at Ringway, and in training, PTs, runs, moot marches, lectures on escape and evasion, so on. And the evening they did parachute jumps at night. A model of the area around the aqueduct was made by an RF officer and used as a training aid by the RF air crews. Because I think it's quite, it would have been quite a good feat of navigation just to find that valley anyway, because bearing in mind with, the RAF's track record, although they weren't really bombing Germany too much at this stage, they already knew they had problems finding most places at night on dead reckoning. So let's crack on to the next one, please, if we may. So if you like, just if you can, people can see that and give you a little idea of.
Oh, I just lost Neil there for a second. Well, while we're waiting for Neil to connect himself back into the show, I don't know what's going on there. I'm just reminding you folks, tomorrow's show, 7 p.m. GMT time, we have our final part of our Footsteps in the Pacific. So Stephen McLeod is joining us to talk about Marines on Saipan. And one of the particular cool things about that show is that we're going to have there's a really good story about Lee Marvin, the actor. You may remember I did an interview with Lee Marvin's biographer a number of months ago, and so Steve is going to carry on some of Lee Marvin's story on Saipan, and that's going to be really cool. So yep, I think Neil is back now. So there we go.
Yep, here we go. Sorry, apologies for that. We're not doing too well. Anyway, quickly crack on. As you can see, there's some of the training that they had for shooting, pack parachutes, discussions, lectures on escaping, lecture by the medical officer, pack parachutes and containers, dress rehearsal, for example, on the 30th of January, run, kit inspection, container drill, pay and range, most importantly, as you can see there. Quickly move on, Paul, to the next one, just to finish it off. Lecture withdrawal, range again. As you can see, they were going to use the Thompson submachine gun for shooting practice, which would have probably been a relatively new weapon to most of them. So the training, as you can see, was quite intense, although even on a Saturday, went up to 8 o'clock in the evening. Yeah, I think yes. So apologies for this. This is one of those very low quality images, but we are very lucky to have it, if you know what I mean. This, if you like, is a mock-up of the piers of the Tragino Aqueduct that the engineers used to practice their. They didn't blow it up, but they practiced loading the stores to it. So the idea was that they would, if for want of a better word, you'd put a plank of wood with wire round the aqueduct, and then the explosives would be hung from it. So you needed ladders And they got it down, if you like, to about 30 to 40 minutes to put all the explosives on there. And the idea was to take about a ton of explosives, 2,400 pounds, because obviously the Whitleys could only carry a limited amount of kit and the fuel, etc., etc. So if you like, I think it gives you an idea of that you needed ladders, you needed boards, and you needed wire strops and ratchets and things to enable the explosives to be hung from the pier, because it wasn't like some bridges, I understand, they have like spaces put in them where you pack explosives, a bit like Pegasus Bridge, I think there was, or you've got to attach it to one of the piers. Anyway, I do apologize for the poor quality image, but hopefully it give you an idea of what they trained themselves to do.
Yep.
So again, just a quick way, each Whitley, it was calculated, could carry 6 men plus stores and a bomb to reach Italy and back from Malta. And the stick, as we said before, went through a hole in the floor. So if you like, it's taken on a training jump. And we spelt Whitley correctly on that one, you notice.
Yeah.
So this gives you an idea of people of what was taken in the containers. So as you can see, explosives made up almost 2/3 of the of the containers taken. So there were 20 containers with explosives and 2 charge boards made up in each one. Then you had 5 what they called ladder containers, and that was like the kit that you needed to attach the boards to the piers. And then you've got 7 weapons containers and 1 for food, 9 haversacks of food. And as you can see, as we've said before, you've got, what have we got? 16 of the very expensive Thompson submachine guns. Were, I think we only probably had about 200 in the whole country at the time. But they were given that, and I guess as well because they took similar ammunition to the pistols, so that made it a lot easier. The 9 haversacks of food, according to several of the veterans, mainly contained something called pemmican. This is one of the staple foods taken on many of the Arctic and Antarctic polar expeditions before the war. Certainly was taken by Scott on his trip down to the Antarctic in 1912, I think it was. Two of the veterans I spoke to said it tasted like concentrated greasy bovril. And basically it was meat extract with added fat. Now, as I've never tasted pemmican, I will bow to their superior knowledge. But again, it's something else this.
It comes up a lot in Native American histories. The Lakota and the Cheyenne, they talk about it a lot. It's a kind of a jerky. I suppose that'd be a similar thing there. And it's a high protein meat kind of dried product. Yeah, it doesn't say jerky's nice, but yeah, apparently by all accounts, it isn't very nice.
No, and obviously they took some stoves with them as well, but we'll come on to that later. I think that just about covers that one, doesn't it? So
yep.
They came up, this is what the men were going to be worn on the flight out to the operational base, which was Malta: Sidcot suit, which is obviously a flying suit, battle dress, gabardine jacket, Mae West, balaclava helmet, flying helmet with intercom for officers, silk gloves, woolen gloves, 3 pairs of socks, and no boots when you're in your sleeping bag. The RAF had said, this is another interesting little thing here, follow on of a character who had a better war, or did more things in the war. None of the aircraft used for the training at Ringway could be used for the operation. So 8 Whitleys from numbers 51 and 78 squadrons were selected to take part under the command of a Wing Commander John Tate, and he later went on, as I'm sure many of you are aware, to command 617 Squadron, the Dambusters. These pilots obviously had to adjust themselves to dropping men from around 500 feet rather than bombs from around 30,000 feet. So I think if we go to the next one. So whilst the guys were in the aircraft, they were given a sleeping bag, an ever hot bag, a lilo, a thermos flask, 2 paper bags, sick men for the use of, as we say, food for the flight and chewing gum, earplugs, a statute, a hot water bottle for urination. But the statute was to be taken off under orders to take off, used as a pillow. Each man would have 2 haversacks, steel helmet and respirator, which would be taken off on entering the aircraft. So just go back one, please, if I may. I've just got.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Just to say a bit that obviously they sent an advance party out, and Lieutenant Dean Drummond left Ringway on the 24th of January for Plymouth, and they flew out by Sunderland flying boat to Malta with some aircraft fitters to service the Whitleys. In fact, he didn't leave till the 31st of January. They stopped at Malta, then arrived at Gibraltar, then arrived at Malta 1st of February. And he did say to me that he was told the objective of the operation before he left Malta, before leaving for Malta. The same day he arrived in Malta, a full dress rehearsal for the operation took place. That can be described as somewhat unsatisfactory. Large amounts of cloud and strong winds meant that the RAF dropped the guys, half the men in the away from the correct location. Several men were blown into trees. A couple had to be rescued by the Knutsford Fire Brigade. The containers couldn't be found. It wasn't a great dress rehearsal, as we say on these occasions, but nevertheless, prior planning and preparation prevent piss poor performance. So hopefully we've had the piss poor performance, and they knew what was doing. So in then after that, and the men were dropped by the Whitleys who were taking them out to Malta. So they had also had experience of dropping some paratroopers before the actual operation. So then the following day, the 8 Whitleys flew to Middenhall in Suffolk, which was the departure aircraft. A few last minute rehearsals on the ground, for want of a better word, before ex-troop also went to RAF Middenhall when they went on low-flying army buses, got there. So we've done the clothing. Just a quick word from this flight out from Middenhall to Malta, what at the time was one of the longest flights ever undertaken by the RAF. I reckon it took about 11 hours, and it was a record for a Malta flight, and all aircraft made it, much to, I think, everyone's surprise, even though 8 set out. Harry Paxton, one of the guys who'd been selected for aid, he said, "I don't have any special recollections of the flight, except it was like travelling in a coffin for 11 hours. It was a bloody long, cold flight. The feel of solid ground under my feet again was a real pleasure, and I do recall the bright sunshine after leaving England in snowy conditions." And another point I want to add here, they were seen off by the head of Combined Operations, Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, and he spent more time talking to our friend Lucky than anybody else, which probably didn't go unnoticed and added even further suspicion into the minds of the men who were going. So if we could go to the next one, Paul, please. Cracking on here. So this was the flight in. Mount the operation from Malta. 8 wind bombers, as I said, were taking part. 6 would carry the men and supplies, and a couple of bombs, lightweight bombs each. 2 others would fly to Foggia to bomb the railway yards there. And the other 6 aircraft, after dropping the paratroopers, would then fly onto Foggia in the hope that the Italians weren't aware that any paratroopers had actually landed in there. And then the plan was, of course, that they would make it after the raid, or the viaduct has hopefully been blown up, they would walk to the west coast of Italy, where they were picked up by a Royal Naval submarine from Malta. So, as again, this is some of the stuff that the guys had to wear on the flight in. No Sidcot suit on Mae West. Statue kept on, but let the bollock crusher between the legs remained unfastened for a time. Boots kept on, 1 pair of socks. Haversacks kept on. Knee pads and elastic anklets, as we said, that the knee pads was a German invention that we copied, and still, I mean, I've never been able really to work this one out. Why take the steel helmet and the respirator all the way to Malta if you weren't going to take them on the raid? But anyway, we digress.
Army logic.
Decided they were too heavy. Anyway, let's crack on to the next one. They didn't take the explosives because obviously they could get that in Malta, so they managed to get 2,400 pounds of gun cotton in Malta. and the other bits and pieces, and arranged billets. And Dean Drummond did all of that. The equipment was checked on the 9th with the intention of carrying out the operation on the 9th of the 10th, 11th of February. The governor of Malta, General Dobby, visited on the morning of the 9th, wishing them good luck. And also on this day, they decided to risk flying one of the pioneer photographic reconnaissance pilots over Italy from Malta. Was he a flight lieutenant or flying officer, Adrian Warburton? And he flew at 24,000 feet and took this wonderful photograph. I'm amazed it wasn't covered by a cloud in February. And they discovered then, to their horror, that there were appeared to be two aqueducts over in this area. So they decided to blow the larger one up, the one on the right-hand side of the photograph with the bigger arrow. The other good thing that it said is the planned drop zone appeared to be entirely suitable, with no signs of defensive measures or indeed troops in the area. So that was another little bit of start. But there again there's your briefing, there's your map or your briefing photograph for the raid. Slightly different from what things like happened at D-Day and Arnhem, where there was extensive photographic reconnaissance, resistance reports. Even if you don't account them, there was no idea of how many troops were in the area, etc., etc., etc. So it very much was, as we say, a leap into the darkness. Right, let's go on to the next one. Now, so just to give you an idea of what the wanks were to wear. So they had the battle dress, special trousers, less parachute badge, boots, socks, braces or belt, underclothing, shirt, haversacks with a sling, waist belt with Colt and holster and 18 rounds ammunition, helmets, balaclava and flying, gloves woolen, gabardine jacket, anklets and knee pads, identity discs and a pullover. And then in their pockets, the field dress in their Army Book 64, clasp knife, 2 grenades, box of matches in a container and waterproof, plaster and iodine pencil, chewing gum, a little toilet paper, 4 other ranks, a pair of pliers in the pocket, and no letters or diaries were to be carried. Give you some idea. So it's very much. And then each man, as we said, had 2 haversacks, and this is what they got: ground sheet, spare pair of socks, mess tin and 4-day special rations, small enamel mug, a torch, nothing else. In addition, 12 water bottles empty, 12 filled stoves, 12 filled petrol containers. Each man, officer and man would therefore have one of these under arrangements made by the OCX troops. Officers, compasses and watches, officers to wear field glasses and carry maps. Each of the 3 escaping parties was to carry in addition 1 sextant and tables, 60 feet of rope, 2 elastic bandages, 2 pairs of sweep razor blades, brush, soap and comb.
Brilliant.
The sextant, I guess, and there we have, the sextant, I guess, to help them navigate cross country. And if you like, there you are. I know it's, if you like, it's almost like one of our reenactor friends doing it, but that is, I guess, a pretty good image of what they would have looked like.
Brilliant stuff.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, if there are anybody listening, we are now coming to the real crux of the matter.
People are waiting with bated breath, Niels. The suspense is killing people.
Yes, on the ground, the men were briefed on the forthcoming raid on the afternoon of the 10th, and there was much relief when they found out they were going to Italy to blow up the aqueduct. The rumour machine, obviously, in cases of this, had come up with the guess that the target was in, I don't know where this came from, nobody would ever explain it properly, was Abyssinia, which is in Africa. Harry Pexton recalled, we were told that the target was actually in Italy. It had been a well-kept secret, and we had often discussed amongst ourselves and suggested where the target would be. Several blokes saying Abyssinia, Albania, or North Africa, and I can't remember anyone suggesting Italy. In Malta, the officers were let into the evacuation plan. They would split up into smaller parties and rendezvous near the coast to pick up on the agreed date. The actual route to the pickup point would be left to the groups themselves. We've done that bit about the Whitleys going on to bomb Foggia, and so the idea was to be over the drop zone at about 9:30 in the evening. So we're not actually that far off. Almost, if you think Central European time, it's 9 o'clock out your time. So we're not that far off the DZ, Mr.
Yeah.
Pritchard said to the men, You are pioneers or guinea pigs, and you can choose which you prefer. That is one of the words he apparently said to them. Dean Drummond commented that it was a gin clear night. There was a slight problem with one of the engineers in Captain Daly's plane. Said he felt sick, so he wanted to go, not wishing to go with the man. He was removed from the aircraft, and that led to a bit of a delay, 15 minutes for this plane, so it was lagging a bit behind. So his party took off one short, so there was actually 35 men on the raid. Dean Drummond was the first one to land. He landed very close to the objective, and he started to round up with his men the locals who had heard the low-flying aircraft and had come out of their houses. Let's be politically correct and call it houses. And he started to round them up and, in inverted commas, take them prisoner. 5 sticks were actually dropped in the correct valley. And Dean Drummond was within about 250 yards of the aqueduct. So when you think about, given some of the, the not very accurate bombing by the RAF, these pilots did pretty well to find a little small area like that in the middle of, basically in the middle of nowhere. But perhaps it was a clear night, so perhaps, as I say, the password was Heil Hitler, followed by a plan of Viva Duchy. The locals were asked, one man, Lance Corporal Harry Bolton, broke his leg on landing, so he had to be left basically where it was because obviously the objective took precedence over casualties. Although a lot of the men, although some landed within 250 yards, others dropped up to about a mile away, which obviously meant that the containers were about a mile away. They didn't take any trolleys. There wasn't enough room to take any trolleys. So the idea was that these had to be man-handled towards the aqueduct. Well, doesn't
sorry, we just add a question. We did have a couple of questions earlier, Neil, about how it would work in terms of weapons and containers. Obviously they've got a Colt pistol on their belt, but all the small arms, all the Thompsons and Brens are in the containers. Yeah,
correct.
So they have to rely on finding those containers, this is again, this is the first operation, so the assumption is they are going to be near the jump, but potentially it could have gone wrong. The containers might not have landed in the right place. Then you've got to find them, and it's dark. They did find them very swiftly. Then generally
speaking, because the other thing is that the containers had small lamps on them that lit when they hit the ground. So at least you had an idea of looking for a light. But no, generally speaking, of course, the other idea was, perhaps this is quite an important point here. 2 men would sit, basically, one man would sit with his legs dangling in a hole with the other one close to it, number 2. Then number 3 would be sitting behind number 1. He would then go out 3, then 4. Then the man in charge of the stick, who was number 6, would then press the button to release the containers. So the containers, in theory, were dropped after 4 men and before numbers 5 and 6. So the chances are the containers would, in theory, be landing in the middle of the
stick.
To try and make it easier. Didn't always work like that, because sometimes the containers got stuck or didn't release. And the wind.
Did you say what altitude the jump was at? Did you say that already?
Say that again.
Did you say what altitude the jump was at?
Oh, it was about 500 feet.
So fairly, not as low as they can go, but pretty low. So it should be fairly accurate at that height, at that altitude.
Yeah, but the problem was that some of the men weren't. The problem was they weren't dropped. If they'd have all been dropped, say, right on top of the objective with their explosives on their kit bags that they jumped in, they would have had, a bit more weight of explosive with them. But as it was, some landed about a mile away. And I think if we actually go to perhaps the next slide, that'll give you. I mean, this is a bit of poetic license, of course, in a painting by Norman Hughes. Because you've obviously got the aqueduct right in the middle. Can we go on to the next one as well? Because the one I'm looking for, there we are. If you like, I don't know if you can sort of make it out, but the blobs, the oval blobs, if you like, in the middle, on the track of the aircraft, direction of run up. You've got 4 by the 4 going north from the viaduct, from the aqueduct. Those are approximately where the 5 groups landed, and the other one was in a different value off the map. So one group completely got in the wrong valley. So the 5 men of Captain Daly's party, I know we're jumping about a bit, but it's all good stuff, I hope. The men of Captain Daly's party never made it to the aqueduct because they didn't know roughly where they were. And so obviously all his containers were lost as well, which was 5 explosive charges were lost. But otherwise, you've got all of these guys from the farm up to, if you like, where the river is, the River of Fanto. The supplies were spread out along that area of around a mile. So they decided to try and they got the locals. They persuaded the locals if they would come and help the containers. Now they all readily agreed, strangely enough. One of them apparently said nothing much happened in this remote valley and it will give us something to talk about in years to come. That was at the start. They trudged off to coast the mountains, guarded by the men. The containers obviously were heavy and it was hard work. There were no trolleys. They could have, I suppose, see if they could have got a horse and cart, but nobody ever thought of that. And it was during this is an interesting little aside. It was during the movement of one of these containers being carried by some Italians that an elderly Italian peasant said, "Are you guys English?" In English with a very much an a broad American accent. It turned out he had spent several years in New York working in a hotel, a bit like Peachy. And apparently one of the men in the vicinity, strangely, he's never been named. He said, "No chums, we're Abyssinians on our way to Sunday school." Now, whether that is actually true or not, I don't know, but it sounds like a good story. But obviously, I think us Brits have the perception of the Italians of being a bit work shy, and soon they were grumbling and moaning about the weight of the containers and it was heavy work. And anyway, but nevertheless, the Italian government later rewarded medals to most of these for their gallant behaviour in the face of the enemy. Can we just quickly go back a couple of slides just to make sure that we've sort of talked through that, haven't we? That gives you, there's a lot, we've done that, local, done that, done that one. Let's go to the next one. So that's a bit of a long range shot, if you like, from away, but does give you an idea of you've got the aqueduct basically in the middle of the photograph with its basically 3 sort of pillars supporting it. So obviously the idea was Pritchard in theory should have gone with Captain Daly and Second Lieutenant Patterson to survey it, and the idea was to blow up at least 2 of the pillars if all of the explosives arrived. It was now very much the same as the model they had trained on back in England. They had led to believe back in England from information supplied that it was made of brick, but when Lieutenant Patterson got up there, got his hammer and chisel out, he found it was made of reinforced concrete, which obviously was a lot stronger and a lot more of a tougher nut to crack than just brick. Then the next problem that you've got is this is where, as I said, this is, as I usually say on these occasions, the first time that Murphy's airborne law came into play. Everything that can go wrong will go wrong. Only a third of the explosives could be collected, about 800 pounds. So Patterson decided that he could only realistically really have a go at 1 pillar. What else should we say here? So they started work then and they got it up there in about 20-25 minutes. They managed to get the ladders out, the boards onto that. I've got a comment here from Sapper Don Struthers. Thanks, David K. Huge intelligence failure, but we didn't have any intelligence. You've seen the intelligence. You didn't know it was brick or reinforced concrete, David.
Yeah, well, I think that's the point he's making. I think
you're right. By using the ladders, we're able to run a steel cable around the column about 10 to 12 feet off the ground. 4 boxes of gun cotton were attached to a plank of wood with a hook at either end, and we suspended the charges from the cable until we encircled the common. So, and additionally, I think Dean Drummond in his role as a sort of like an infantry security guard, he discovered a small bridge, another small bridge over a small stream about 150 yards away, and Patterson got permission to blow that as well. It was hoped the demolition of that would delay the repair effort. So they managed to spare 2 14-pound boxes of gun cotton, and 2 of the sappers put that there, set the charge, and eventually all was ready. Soon after midnight, charges had been placed. The Italians were escorted back into one of the farm buildings close to the bridge, escorted by Lieutenant Drummond, and they were told that a sentry had been posted outside by one of the Italian speakers with orders to shoot anybody who came outside. So soon after midnight, somewhere between midnight and midnight, a slab of gun cotton was let off as a warning sign, so everybody took cover, and eventually they heard a bang. The air was silent as they were waiting for the explosion. And then there was a huge explosion, and there was smoke, masonry, and concrete flying around. And then Dean Drummond, the second bridge went up, and then they slowly walked forward, and they could hear the sounds of rushing water. So they knew then that they had done some success. They cheered and cheered, even though they were in enemy country. So at least that part of the operation worked wet. Arthur Lawley, one of the men on the raid, said, "We inspected our handiwork and found we had made a good job of it. To hear the water rushing down the mountainside like a raging torrent was music to our ears. We had achieved what we had set out to do." The explosion was clearly heard by Captain Daly and his party in the next valley, and that cheered them up, I suppose. But they then, the decision then that they would now decide to head straight for the coastal rendezvous, and rather than try and look for the aqueduct. I mean, obviously they couldn't do anything about moving their supplies. Back at the aqueduct, they went down to inspect the damage. One pier had gone completely, and another leaned at a drunken angle, and half the aqueduct was down. Water was pouring from both ends. It was not the time or the place, obviously, to spend time admiring their handiwork. Major Pritchard now revealed that a submarine will be coming to pick them up in a few nights' time at a place. I think we can go to the next slide, Paul.
And we had a question earlier about whether they have a radio with them.
No. I'm going to come on to that. Good question, well put. Hold that thought for a moment. So I think we've just got another idea of that's, if you like, one of the more modern day pictures of the aqueduct. And I think if we could go to the next one, please. And there again, if you like, this is the pillar that was blown up, and you can basically see some damage going from the left-hand side towards the left-hand side of the aqueduct. Yep, next one, please.
And I think the modern photos don't kind of convey its importance at the time, because it's kind of it's not used anymore, it's abandoned, so it kind of just looks like a relic in the middle of nowhere. But at the time, it was a little bit more
I'll say
the system.
This is, if you like, this is almost like, isn't it? I thought about this the other day. This is almost like one of Arthur Bomber Harris's panacea targets, isn't it? We knock this water. If we stop the water to supply to 3 ports, Bari, Brindisi, and Taranto, which are supplying the Italian war effort, that is going to have quite a detrimental effect on those 3 towns for a few days or months or weeks or months. Just didn't know, but it really was, if you like, a bottleneck. It's another ball bearing, isn't it?
Yeah.
Swine for ravens. Anyway, let's go to the. Yep. So I've got a little bit ahead. We've spoken about this. As you can see, is admittedly late. Dean Drummond later admitted that he thought he wanted to hear another bang. So there's the fun of the thing. Anyway, let's go on. Excellent. So we've got to slide 45, ladies and gentlemen. You'll be pleased here. Only another 300 to go. Only joking. So this was now revealed to the men. The officers already knew, but this is where they were. The men now were told that on the night of the 15th, 16th of February, a Royal Navy submarine, HMS Triumph, would be out in the water somewhere. This is the closest shot I could get to the mouth of the River Selly without endangering my life on Google Earth again. This is, if you like, place is not too far from a place that some of you may have heard of called Salerno. It's south of Salerno. This is the mouth of the River Selly, and it's about 60 miles from the aqueduct. So it was going to be quite an arduous trek in 5 days. I know 60 miles doesn't sound a lot, but they'd done obviously many sessions of physical training, both at Ringway and up in Scotland as well, that they'd done. So the night of the 15th, the 16th of February, and if they didn't, if the men got there and the submarine if the submarine got there and there weren't any men to pick up, it was going to come back as a fallback position on the night of the 17th, 18th as a fallback position. That was the last chance saloon. And the commander of the operation, Pritchard, had talks with the commander of the submarine, Lieutenant Colonel Woods, to make sure there were no misunderstanding about the plan. And the men were going to signal to the submarine by torch from the land, and that was their only form of communication, was a torch. There was no radio taken at all. I'll talk about that a little bit more, because now we come into another one of Murphy's airborne law. One of the Whitleys that had made it to the area of Foggy had dropped its bombs, was suffering engine failure. So that aircraft, S Sugar, piloted by someone called Pilot Officer Wotherspoon, crash landed in the mouth of this river. And his men, and then he sent, just before he landed, they sent a message in code back to Malta saying they were ditching, and could a rescue party be sent to pick them up, please, from their dinghy. The Navy, probably with the opinion that the code that they'd used had already been broken, said that it's too risky to send our submarine there. So even before the guys, basically even on about the 13th of February, even before they got even halfway roughly to the pickup point, the submarine was recalled to Malta. So there was no submarine coming for them anyway. And as I say in my notes, there was no such niceties of any communication to the men of X-Troop, because they had no radio. Why they didn't take a radio, I suspect, not sure that we actually had one that was probably going to work that well. The difficulties of getting it to work with a Royal Naval boat, submarine, for want of a better word, plus you had to carry it, plus the batteries needed to be charged. But all they had,
surviving the jump, the valves, the fuses, depending on which language you want to speak, surviving it. Yeah, there's a lot of variables, but it again, harking back to how we started off the show, it does demonstrate that these sort of 41, 42 raids didn't necessarily have that thoroughness behind them, that things later on, there are these little things you can look at and say, perhaps that should have been done. And this is no criticism of the men on the raid, although it's just at a higher level, there's perhaps just not enough experience to kind of make sure you've got these things catered for, and you know, you've got kind of plan B and plan C.
I think as well is you got to consider is containers were a relatively new invention as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, and most of the kit that was dropped was pretty robust. I mean, having said that though, the sextants were delicate instruments as well. So, but anyway, so in answer to the question, the only means of communication with the outside world that the guys had were torches, and there was no submarine coming. So let's crack on to the next one, please. So if you like, the guys obviously had no way of getting to the area, the pickup point, except on foot at the moment. They had no transport with them. So they all split up into 3 groups, well, 4 groups if you consider it really, because obviously Captain Daly's group was marching independently somewhere up there north of the River Afanto at the time. And the idea was, of course, that they would move by night and hide up by day. And obviously, as they moved off, they split up into 3 groups. Major Pritchard with Dean Drummond, Captain Lee and Second Lieutenant Patterson in charge of the 2nd, and Jowett with Flight Lieutenant Lucky in the 3rd. And they all had somewhere between 7 and 10 men with them. Tommy guns. They took the decision actually to leave most of the heavy weapons behind as well. Although one bloke insisted on carrying the Bren with him, which I think he probably came to regret that, because that was when, because even though these guys had obviously done a lot of cross-country work and what have you, they found the going extremely tough. They even though they walked on the first night, most of them, they reckon around 15 to 20 miles, they'd only covered 6 miles on the ground towards the pickup point. And that was the problem, that they had to hide up in the day. There wasn't always sufficient cover, and there was also a lot of locals around, peasant farmers with typical, bit like Bravo 20 in the Iraq desert, goat herds, sheep, dogs, you know, and cross country, and the guys became knackered basically. Obviously, Lance Corporal Bolter had been left behind. He was left with a Thompson machine gun and told, you know, do your best, mate, and then left him because obviously casualties, the operation was taking precedence over casualties. You know, Dean Drummond said, the country became wilder and wilder, impossible than ever. The moonlight distorted every natural hummock and glade into grotesque and weird straightnesses. Before us stretched mile upon mile of the roughest country we had ever seen. Few landmarks could be picked out, so we decided to march by compass to a large crossroads near the source of the Selly River. During the night's march, we had to cover some 20 miles and then find hideouts for the following day, somewhere along the north side of the Selly Valley. The other thing, of course, is you've got countless small streams, so you've always got wet feet potentially, and it was cold and they weren't getting a great deal of food. Sometimes the cover they could find, they managed to survive, if you like, most of them for 2 to 3 days. But basically, the decision came towards the end that they knew they weren't making good enough progress, so they decided that they'd better start marching on the roads to make better progress. This is where that was quite clever. The Italian speakers would ask anybody who locals that they were either Austrian or German troops out on exercise. So they did try and, if you like, come up with some sort of cover story, but eventually it didn't work. And if we go to the next slide, please, Paul. The guys were captured somewhere on roads and trying to cross bridges because the Carabinieri, if you like, were out looking for them. The Italians were absolutely outraged, horrified, and organised a large hunt. A bit like, you know, the Great Escape that we probably watched the programmes on, a Gross Verhandlung or whatever it was called. They mobilised everybody. And of course, the villagers, they gave them away as well. You know, there was no resistance to try and help them. So they were very much on their own. And I think their luck ran out, basically. And they took the decision to march on the roads because the going was so rough, because they were all still looking for this deadline of the 15th or the 16th.
And again, just to interrupt there, you know, with the people who are watching who have relatives who are on this raid, and we have a couple watching, which is amazing. This later on, an operation like this would probably have had liaison contacts with a resistant network. There'd have been some fallback plan of, if you can't get to rendezvous A, here's a rendezvous B. There'd have been some kind of, or make your way for a safe house here. The people who paid with their lives on these early operations or imprisonment or whatever are paving the way for those who were able to reap the benefits of this 2 and 3 years on when things have got better. It's sad for these folks, but they're learning lessons for others to follow.
It's an interesting point that I'm just going to digress slightly, Paul, and we can perhaps talk about this offline at another time, because how much how much resources, even by 1943, say, did SOE have in Italy? I don't think they had a great deal. I mean, there was obviously the partisans, and then Italy, of course, to my knowledge, I can't think of, apart from till we invaded in 1943, that was it. I don't think SOE did anything much in Italy during the rest of the war.
But maybe if they had known about this is the kind of thing, if it had been planned over a longer length of time, a team would have been sent in earlier, the recce team of local, like a Jedburgh type of SOE thing, and then this mission would have followed some weeks later. I'm feeling like Anthropoid, when we talk about that in 42, in Czechoslovakia, there were kind of an early teams, then mid teams, and it was all part of a system. Okay, there was tragedy there as well, but this infancy stage, there are these improvements that we can see with hindsight that would have made things a bit better. But again, it doesn't take anything away from the bravery of these incredible soldiers.
I would say, I mean, you know, they were basically on a one-way ticket. You know, with the benefit of hindsight, sitting here knowing what we know now, it was a one-way ticket, and they were never ever going to get picked up.
Yeah.
And I know one of the guys said to me, he said he felt that we should really have tried to nick a car and driven to the coast, which was probably a better idea, really. But I guess when you've got 35 men, how many vehicles do you need?
Yeah.
You know, shall we crack on?
And also they've got a plan that is specified exactly what they're carrying in their haversacks. These are men trained to follow a plan. Here's the plan. The officers are going to do.
Yes.
They're hamstrung by the fact there is this plan. They've not been given the room for maneuver, sadly, to kind of improvise. It's interesting. We go off tangent about planning, and anyway, let's carry on with the story.
I mean, but anyway, these so eventually some good news. I put in exclamation mark. As you can see, very soon after the raid, around the 15th of February, forward 5 days after the raid. The Italian press agency, this is where we picked up on it. The official Italian press agency issued some communiques which were picked up by us. And as you can see, so we've got some good, nice headlines for the Times reader to read over his kippers in the morning. Parachutists in Italy reported British action, etc., etc. And together with the Italians having a bad time as well into Italian Somaliland. I'll just read a few words, if you like, from the Italian press release. During the night of February 10th to 11th, the enemy dropped detachments of parachutists in Calabria and Louisiana. They were armed with machine guns, hand grenades, and explosives. Their objectives were to destroy our lines of communication and to damage the local hydroelectric power stations. Owing to the vigilant and prompt intervention of our defence units, all the parachutists were captured before they were able to cause serious damage. In an engagement which took place, one gendarme and one civilian was killed. So there were 2 Italian casualties, which were obviously shot by men of X-Troop, and they were quite lucky to get away with their lives because some of the Italians who captured them were locals armed with shotguns, as well as some gendarmerie. So they could well have been shot on the spot. But anyway, some good news. Came back and said that we've destroyed, but the Italians obviously tried to play it down. It said a search was instituted, making the position of the parachutists very precarious. Speedily surrounded, they were unable to execute their plans and had to hide in woods and to avoid capture. And they said the search went on and the rest of the paratroopers, including a captain, that's Daly, were seized without trouble. The men claimed they were British paratroopers and were dressed in khaki clothing, Air Force caps, spoke fluent Italian and had plenty of Italian lira. So the Italians are doing their best to play down it. As it turned out, the damage was repaired quite quickly and the water supply was not really affected in any of the 3 ports mentioned. But you can see, as far as we are concerned, we've got good news for the newspapers here. We have done some striking back.
Yeah. We
may be surrounded. We may be on an island faced, and you've occupied the rest of Europe. But also another effect of the raid is that it, I don't like to, I won't use the word I was thinking of. It scared the Italians. So they started guarding power stations, dams, infrastructure like that, which is all a drain on manpower.
Yeah.
One man guarding a dam in the middle of the Italian Apennines is not a man who's fighting in Somalia or in Libya, for example. So the guys were all rounded up and taken, all 35 of them were taken to Naples Central Prison, where they were interrogated several times. Want to go to the next slide, please, Paul? So it's believed during these interrogations that they didn't really gain much from them, because I know one of the men told me that when he asked what aircraft he'd come to Italy in, he said the Heinz 57. So obviously a lot of the guys, name, rank and number, etc., etc. But obviously 2 people came in for quite a nasty interviews without coffee. One of whom, of course, was our friend Fortunato Picci. They didn't think he was a Frenchman, pre-Frenchman under the name of Henri Dupont. And this is a picture of him taken when he was in captivity on the left there. he looked very Mediterranean, and his English was not as good as the others. So consequently, one morning he disappeared after a particularly nasty interrogation, and the Italians shot him on Palm Sunday, the 6th of April, 1941. And as you can see, that actually the news filtered back, and that reported in British newspapers. As you can see, Savoy's Peaches dies for us, Wade to Hero shot, he died for freedom. That was in the Gulf. Harry Pexton, he said to me, I always felt sorry for Peachy. He was a very nice guy, but he sucked like a sore thumb amongst the rest of us. He just looked like an Italian. I think that's the problem, is if you've got a line of 35 men and 2 of them sort of stand out on an identity parade, they are the ones that you are going to look for. So after they worked out that he was Italian, spotlight then fell on Private Tristan. Bit of a stupid name to take, really, because it's almost, isn't it, an anagram of Nastri, his real name. And they thought he was an Italian. But of course, we had the advantage of living in London, so he actually spoke like a Londoner. Even so, the Italians thought they knew who he was and brought one of his aunts from Naples, lived near Naples, to the prison, but she didn't identify him. So he was a very, very lucky man.
Wow.
Meanwhile, Lucky, even though he spoke fluent Italian, he was so obviously British in his appearance and mannerism that no real heat was put on him, for want of a better word. But nevertheless, John Tristan got away with it. And Harry Pexton again said John Tristan was lucky because even though he did look Italian, his English was so good it put doubt in their minds, and he was able to get away with it. So he's the only fatal casualty, and and in recent years he's been added to the SOE section at the Brookwood Memorial, which is nice. So if we could crack on to the next. So this again is another one of those interesting photographs that appeared. A lot of the guys from ex-troop, the officers were removed and taken to special camps, where Dean Drummond made several attempts to escape and eventually made it back to Switzerland in June 1942, and he was able to give the first-hand reports of Operation Colossus. So that meant most of the men, the other ranks, were in a prisoner of war camp at Sulmona, Campo 27, just called Sulmona. They didn't go and try and stop escaping. Some of them dug tunnels, but that was discovered. And then no one really got very far in escaping until the Italian surrender in December 1943. Obviously, the guards just seemed to vanish into thin air, and several people took the opportunity to disappear. Sergeants Clements and Lawley jumped over the wire and had a testing 4-week trek towards the Allied lines, which they reached in mid-October successfully. Harry Bolter, the guy who'd broken his leg, he also escaped, joined a group of Italian partisans and stayed with them for nearly 9 months in the mountains fighting. Second Lieutenant Patterson, he also escaped and ended up fighting for a while with the Italian partisans, and then made it to Switzerland, and then came back to Italy to fight with SOE against the Germans after the Italian surrender. And finally, for this little slide, but not quite finally, our Colossus Enigma Lucky. He tried several times to escape when he was in Italy, but got recaptured every time. And he got moved to Germany, like a lot of the men did, and wasn't released until 1945. But lucky, he made it back to the UK. When he got to his German prisoner of war camp, he started to smoke cigarettes laced with aspirin, which led to him to convince the doctors that he had heart failure at a medical board. So he was repatriated on ill health grounds to England and arrived back in September 44, where he appeared before an RAF medical board who could find no sign of any heart condition, and he was rated as A4B, which meant he was fit for ground duties but could only fly as a non-combatant passenger in aircraft. Now, bearing in mind, he was now 48.
Right.
Not likely to be doing any operational flying at the age of 48. And again, I just say again, he appears in the official reports as a flight lieutenant. He was a pilot officer in the RAF list in April 1940, and in April 1941 he had been promoted to flying officer when he was in prisoner of war camp. So again, I call him the enigma. Where he is, what happened to him after the war, remains a mystery. But anyway, let's move on to the next slide, please. So the decorations awarded to the men of ex-troop, so you can see a number of Distinguished Service Order, military crosses, military medals, and mentioned in dispatches. The interesting thing, I suppose, we can say about them, even though apart from the Distinguished Service Order, they were all awarded after the war because the men were in prisoner of war camp. There must be a special dispensation for the DSO. Obviously, Dean Drummond had escaped back to England by now, which is why he got his military cross in September 42. And that's why date unknown, because although the citations went in at the time or soon afterwards, from whatever sources, I'm not sure. The guys, one thing I should have mentioned, the guys had been taught some sort of code as well before they went, so they were able to get messages back from the prisoner of war camp. But nevertheless, that's why all of these, most of the awards for it were after the 1945. So let's go to the next slide because we're coming right to the end, I think.
But at least they were decorated, because we know that we've had other shows where there are people who are part of units whose actions cannot be acknowledged because they were part of something secret. I mean, even things like the Bletchley Park code breakers, at least they got recognition for this, because we know there are groups of individuals who did extraordinary things that the records didn't actually end up acknowledging it. So
the thing you got to realise, Paul, is of course that the raid was in the public eye by then, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It's all in the newspapers. I think we would, unlike other raids that we wanted kept secret, this one was a good bit of propaganda because it was the first time first time we'd used our paratroopers. Because I think a lot of the failed Commando raids were mentioned in the newspaper just for the propaganda value, to answer. So Tony Drummond did go back to the aqueduct in 1989. Unfortunately, your World War II TV has missed that little bit off, but there is the man himself. With the damage by the pillar, as you can see. So it is quite a big aqueduct. I think that gives you an idea of scale for once, doesn't it? Of how big he is. So I think you'll be pleased to hear this is almost the last slide. So if anybody does want to do any bit more, Tony Dean Drummond's book is quite good, called Return Ticket. And obviously the raid is covered in some detail in my book, Striking Back, which is available from Amazon in paperback, I believe, or Hellion. At reasonable prices, I think. And then finally, I just want to do my last slide, if you do, my usual thanks if you've kept it in. My old friend Carol Magri and Claire Hardy, the veterans I met over the years, and as usual, I'm on Fitter and Tastebook. Move through the question.
Yeah, we know what you mean.
To the floor.
Well, there we are. And I'm my summary.
Sorry,
thanks very much for this.
If I may, just one more thing, because I'm always say one more thing. So apart from Dean Drummond, who was at Arnhem, those two sergeants who escaped in 43, Lawley and Clements, they both rejoined the parachute regiments. One went to the 13th Battalion, was present on D-Day, and one I mentioned in dispatches at the Rhine Crossing, and Percy Clements was with the 12th Battalion, commissioned in August 1944, and won a military cross in the Ardennes. Around this time, what's the Ardennes? 77 years ago.
Right. Yeah.
So some of the men went on to have quite distinguished careers. Obviously, Dean Drummond's commanded 22 SAS and became a Major General.
Brilliant.
Anyway.
Well, my conclusion is, as we said, really, that measuring Commando Special Forces raids by the magnitude of the result isn't always the correct way to judge them. You judge them in the process of us sending a message. I mean, people have been saying in the sidebars, it's a bit like the Doolittle raid. It's sending a message to the enemy.
It's a very good analogy, that the Doolittle raid, isn't it?
And it's sending a message to our public as well. It's, you know, people who are thinking of enlisting, people are thinking of volunteering. There's this sense of we're not just sitting back, we're going on the front foot. And all the successful raids, I mean, there is a big question exactly how many airborne raids would be counted by all sides as successful, because we've done a few on this show. The Vyazma raid by the Russians in 42, was that successful? There's Operation Mercury, the Germans into Crete. I mean, how many were successful and how many weren't successful? The point is, though, it's this message of sending out that we can do things, we can get to you where we are. This idea, as you said there, of Italians having to guard power stations and bridges, things like that, that's troops being somewhere that can't be somewhere else.
I think as well, the other thing is Churchill. This is almost totally off topic, but it's all, as I said, this is almost worth a talk in itself. The rise of the airborne forces. We've still only got 500 paratroopers, nearly 6 to 7 months after Churchill said we need 5,000. And this really didn't. And it was another, because of the. I mean, I suppose I'm slightly biased in this. The RAF didn't like airborne forces, and they really need a bloody kick up the backside halfway through the year, because it wasn't until September, realistically, that enough volunteers came forward after the Bruneval raid as well, that they did a real recruiting drive, and that's when you were able to start forming. Just to digress, 11th Special Air Service then in September 41 become the 41 become the first parachute battalion, and then the second and third. That's when you start getting, in December of that year, 41, the large parachute courses at Ringway with 300 men on 2 courses, which formed the nucleus of the second and the third battalions, and a lot of 99% of the Bruneval men went on that one of those 2 large courses. Yeah, no, it's not. It's the journey, isn't it? It's the journey. If we explain, probably the most successful British airborne raid is Varsity, isn't it? Crossing of the Rhine, 45. Yes. Bruneval was more of
Bruneval for a small scale one, Varsity for a large scale operation. So
let's just digress, and obviously I know a bit about Varsity as well. Unfortunately, that has picked up all of the lessons from Normandy and Arnhem, which all went wrong.
Yeah, no, I mean, the point I was going to make is, from February 41 to March 45, just 4 years. I mean, we think of how long it takes to develop armor, tanks or aircraft, and trial runs and prototypes, and our British Army is still using Challengers, the Americans still use things stay in place the same for years now. In this period, in 4 years, you go from people jumping out the bottom of converted bombers to a dedicated force that have all the equipment, all the operational orders, the doctrine to mass jump on the other side of the Rhine and help bring the war to the end. So all the people and the relatives of those who are watching, whose relatives were in this, they are all part of the foundations of the success for things like Varsity, which takes us right up the Falkland Islands and Paras, the
Let's think about Arthur Lawley. Arthur Lawley did both. He did Colossus and Varsity. One of the only man, I'm pretty confident to say, the only man that did both.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there, Neil, because
there's no more questions from the floor.
I think we're done. I think so. I think that we've done them as we go. I think what we'll do is we'll bring you back on again and do airborne, development of airborne forces. And we're bringing you back on for Bruneval anyway, aren't we? You're going to do the on the ground one for that, and that'll be brilliant. So we've been talking for an hour and a half. That's enough for anybody. It's been fantastic. So I'll just remind. Well, we've already said what we're doing tomorrow. And next week, we've got kind of some random shows coming your way, some odd times of day, because I've got some Australian guests. Don't forget, we've got a live stream from Singapore Sunday morning, UK time. And then I've got Alex Kershaw in the evening, but we've got our show tomorrow evening with Stephen McLeod about Saipan. So lots and lots coming up. And Varsity, we should cover Varsity. Well, we have got one Varsity show coming up, Kevin. James Fenelon is coming back on to talk about American gliders as part of Varsity, but we will do British operations at some point. I can't do everything in 1 month, but there's so many shows coming your way. It's unbelievable. But anyway, thanks very much, Neil. I hope we will be able to hoist a pint at some point and meet properly in Normandy or somewhere in the next few weeks or months. Brilliant.
Well, I'd like
Okay,
to I'd thank you for the invite, and thank you everybody for losing an hour and 40 minutes of your life that you'll never get back. And I hope you've enjoyed it.
Brilliant. Cheers, everybody. This is Paul Woodadge saying enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you for everybody for supporting what we do here on World War II TV. Cheers, everybody. Bye.